If we have a few minutes at the end, we will address any remaining questions. So we'll move on to 5607.
Yeah, so 5607 is design criteria for collection practices. And really, this is inlets. So that's just a fancy way of saying how we're collecting stormwater. So just a snapshot of what's really in this section, a table of contents. I won't go through all of these, but really we discuss both traditional inlets as well as what we call roadway retention. And I'll talk about that here in a second. So it's set up by design speed for roadways. So we look at kind of brackets of roads that are less than 45 miles per hour, greater than or equal to 45 miles per hour, or really more parking lot applications. And this is consistent with the Hydraulic Engineering Circular 22 or HEC 22, which is the industry standard for inlet design. So retention, roadway retention, especially with redevelopment type scenarios in a roadway, can have additional constraints and challenges for implementation. So that's why we went the route of defining some of those typical GSI practices for roadway retention that Greg had presented on before, that really you can kind of plug and chug to meet the runoff reduction requirement for public roadway projects. And that section or subsection here really points back to 5605, where the meat of that design criteria lives. So as far as traditional inlet requirements, like I said, we're following the HEC 22 industry standard. But for roads that are less than 45 miles per hour, we also provide an option for a more simplified approach that can be used by applying a standard inlet spacing as well, or in with common sense as well. So we're looking at existing inlets still. We want to make sure that those inlets still work within your new section, or if they even made sense in the first place. So trying to get away from the mode of just remove and replace it because it was there already. Make sure we're looking at sump locations and that those are picked up, including low points and intersections. I think a lot of the times we inadvertently end up with an ADA ramp as a low point, and that's obviously not ideal. And as well as looking at decision points along the roadway. So places that a driver has to react. So think like crosswalks or stop signs, and making sure that we are not pooling water in those locations. So we've got several of the standard inlet spacing tables set up for different roadway configurations, different lane configurations, basically, and those are all built around HEC 22 gutter spread assumptions. So we provide assumptions for typical applications. So the manual will kind of list out what the assumptions are that went into those standard spacings for those different roadway longitudinal slopes. If a site falls outside of that typical, so think if you've got a roadway that's got a lot of unmanaged stormwater run on, that would fall outside of the typical, in which case it just defaults back to those HEC 22 calcs. And then for higher speed roadways, so anything over 45 miles per hour, you're just required to meet gutter spread requirements per HEC 22. Intentionally just referencing that standard and the latest version of that standard because it is something that was updated in February 2024 and will likely continue to be improved upon, but does still serve as kind of the industry best standard. With that, I will kick it back over to Matt to talk about conveyance practices.
Thanks. So again, just the outline for this section, starting at the top, conveyance performance requirements. I'll briefly cover that in the slide. Criteria around overflow routing that Lauren had mentioned, that will be familiar from previous manuals, as well as criteria for enclosed pipe systems. I'll talk a little bit about open channels and natural channels and energy management in the next few slides. Next slide. So this is not a big change in requirement. This slide is just to point out that 1D hydraulic calculations are required per HEC 22. A lot of this section it will be familiar, and as well where we made updates. We're relying a lot on HEC manuals, both for erosion control and 1D hydraulic calculations. There is allowance for 2D hydraulic calculations and/or a combination of both as appropriate. Next slide. So we streamlined quite a bit definitions around open channels. In the previous version of the manual, some of the language could be a bit confusing. So we slimmed this down. And starting at the top, I'll just walk through these definitions and highlight why they're important and to, things to note as you look at this manual. So first, we're using the term stream throughout this section to refer to any channel that drains at least 20 acres. And that 20 acres corresponds to what Greg covered, the threshold for stream preservation. So the term stream corresponds to that 20-acre threshold for preservation. Second is an engineered channel. So these would be channels upstream of a stream. And it's any open channel that's been designed to convey stormwater runoff. And in the manual, you'll see as a subset of engineered channels, swales, natural conveyance channels, and stabilized channels. So these would be engineered elements, engineered channels. Next are natural channels. So this would be an open channel that is in a natural state or has been restored using natural channel design. And there is a section that retains much of the previous manual's content around natural channel design. And then finally, the most upstream element is the major drainage system. So this, or minor drainage system, excuse me. So anything conveying stormwater in the upper portions of the watershed, i.e. 2 acres or less. Typically found upstream of enclosed pipe systems and might sometimes, look like lot-to-lot grading. So that's the channel definitions. I just wanted to point that out as a change to try to promote clarity around open channels in the criteria manual. Next slide. Finally, for energy management, just wanted to point out that energy dissipation, erosion control is points directly to HEC 14. The manual just highlights specific places to look in the manual or in HEC 14 and includes the items listed there. So overall energy dissipation points over to HEC 14 and that's the design expectation for energy dissipation. And that is what I had for conveyance.
Awesome. Now I'm going to walk through our 5609 is the operations and maintenance requirements. So as we mentioned, this section is new. Formerly O&M requirements was pretty silent within 5600 and then really sprinkled throughout the MARC BMP manual practice section. So we really wanted to highlight that, the importance of that and the planning for that up front. So just again, a snapshot of what's in this section, but really what we've had a lot of discussion about both as a team internally with the management stakeholders and with the larger stakeholder group is especially where green infrastructure comes into play, better design equals lower maintenance. So a lot of efforts have been put into this manual to provide better design tools so that we are reducing that maintenance burden long term. Otherwise, we'll go through just a couple of these. I won't go through all of them in detail. So planning for operations and maintenance. So this is kind of a big thing that we wanted to address again up front with the project. So we're requiring a maintenance submittal go in with the concept analysis, which I'll get into in more detail here in the next section. But with the concept submittal requirements, we're wanting you to identify the overarching maintenance requirements for the different stormwater components that you are proposing to use on the project. And we do have tools set up within this maintenance section to really help to streamline that process. But the goal is to really establish those expectations up front and identify who the responsible parties in the plan is going to be for maintaining those components throughout the life of that asset. So during construction, during that warranty or vegetation establishment period, if that's applicable, and then who's the long-term owner for that site going to be, and what's the plan to communicate the maintenance expectations to them as that transitions. So we are proposing that a maintenance manual be developed and recorded with the deed or the plat for the property. So a big challenge with maintenance of these components comes into play when property changes over. So with this, you would have a manual that is basically recorded with the property itself. So when that property does, or if it does change over, that information is still there. So this isn't looking for anything crazy or cumbersome, really just a site map that's identifying what the stormwater components are. So what are those components that you're using to meet the management requirements? And then figures for the practices that identify the key components that are going to require maintenance. What are the typical maintenance tasks and frequencies? And we've got some tools in subsequent sections of the maintenance section that can be used to help, again, streamline that process. And then some standard inspection forms that could be included with this as well that could help serve as MS4 compliance documentation for communities too, if they choose to use those. We do cover access and easements in this section. So formerly this was addressed sometimes within like the conveyance section, and some were silent on it altogether, but really easements and access comes down to some jurisdiction specific requirements. But we wanted to provide some guidelines for easement parameters for these different components of the storm drainage system, if those are used or if the jurisdiction is silent on it. So then moving into 5609.4, we define some typical maintenance tasks and frequencies by storm drainage system component. So you'll see those across the top of this table. We have the preservation and restoration, retention and detention, collection practices, and conveyance practices. So acknowledging that maintenance isn't just applicable to green infrastructure, or gray infrastructure needs some TLC as well. But again, this is really intended to be a resource to simplify that maintenance submittal and that O&M plan to understand, okay, hey, if we're specifying these components to meet our stormwater management requirements, what's the long-term effect of that, and who's going to be responsible for it? We then go on to define detailed task descriptions for each of those that were listed in that table, with photos and resources like that. The intent of this is really this could be plugged and chugged into those maintenance manuals for what's applicable to your project. So again, not trying to create a big burden with the maintenance manual, but also to make sure that we're translating that information from one owner to another. This maintenance section does align with the MARC Regional Green Infrastructure Certification Program training that's out there. So really trying to kind of supplement that material that's out there and expand upon the resources that our region has regarding green infrastructure maintenance. And then we get into 5610, which is last but certainly not least, submittal requirements. So a major goal of this effort be consistency in required submittals from one community to the next. So clearly define expectations and streamline the process for designers and developers and reviewers alike. So this, again, is really just a snapshot of the table of contents for this section, and I'll go through most of these. So starting with the stormwater concept analysis. So this is something that we heard from cities and developers alike early on in the process during those focus group meetings, but the preference would be to know what the requirements are up front so costs can be accounted for. So what the manual is proposing is that this is required on all projects. So looking to consider stormwater management early in those concept planning and design phases so that you can identify what potential existing issues or issues that could come from the proposed improvements are, and to really give the owner the opportunity to capitalize on prioritizing the preservation and restoration opportunities that are then going to let them minimize their stormwater management requirements on the back end of this. So it's pretty simplified. The intent, again, is not to be overly onerous, but to provide something that they can use early on. So really includes 3 components. We've got the KC compliance calculator tables, which I'll show you here. and then a watershed location map, so giving context of where your site is in the overall watershed, and then existing and proposed site conditions maps, which will just, again, kind of give a visual representation of some of the inputs that you're putting into that compliance calculator. So this is kind of the upfront form that we have on the compliance calculator. It's a general requirements table. So here's where you're putting in your basic project information, your site parameters, and based on those inputs and selections, it will tell you whether or not stormwater management is required on your project or if it falls into one of those exemption categories. So if your project falls into one of those exemption categories, this is really it. This is all that we're asking for them to submit. But if not, you'll fill out the remaining forms. It also includes at the bottom there requests for any variances, if any. So again, kind of reviewer knows that up front what they're looking for. It then goes into designer verification tables. So this walks through each of the requirements that are defined in 5602, and it's asking the designer to confirm that those requirements are met where applicable. And in some instances, like in the retention section, it's actually going to pull your inputs from your design calculation tabs up here so that a reviewer can easily see, like, here's what was required on the site and here's what's designed based on their input. So it's a really easy checkpoint, again, for the reviewer to confirm that those requirements are met. But really, it's asking the designer to sign off on the design and meeting those requirements. So both from a landscape professional standpoint, if preservation and restoration practices are included, and from a professional engineer verification standpoint for the retention, detention, collection, and conveyance. So Appendix A has just PDFs of all of these calculation tables. And like I said before, the calculator itself is posted up on the website, so you can kind of get in and see how a user can play with those inputs. And then the last piece of this is those maintenance requirements and responsibilities tables that I just showed you guys. So the second subsection here is a stormwater drainage report. And so as of now, the manuals were proposing to only require a
that if a variance or an exemption to the stormwater management requirements is requested. So really the drainage report would include that initial concept analysis submittal plus additional narratives to justify the reason for the variances and understanding what the existing receiving system is and the impact on that and really kind of documenting that more to a traditional drainage report standpoint. So it outlines a proposed, basically standard section of the outline for this. The next section goes through drawing requirements. So it lists out the sheets. So this is really what was included in the original 5600 or all that was included in the submittal requirements in the original 5600 sections, but goes into a little bit more detail and again tries to align with those requirements that we've got in the design criteria sections. So we've got some narrative and kind of checklists that go along with each of these sheets. And then it goes into drawing best practices. And it's written that way intentionally because a lot of, again, jurisdictions may have their own requirements on plan sheet sizes and scales and what they want to see. But in general, there's some best practices that we can start implementing to make these plans easier and more consistent to read across the board. So that's really what's included in that part B there. And then part C is the retention and detention design component claim requirements. So this pulls all of those GSI component submittal requirements that were on the front page with all of the component sections in 5606 into a checklist format here in this section. And then we have specification requirements. So kind of upfront acknowledging that, again, jurisdictions often have their own standard technical specifications. So that's always the first place that you should start as a designer and understand what those specific requirements are. But then we go through and really introduce those GSI construction specifications and laying out what the standard outline is for those, when and how we can use them, you know, introducing what the component specifications are and what those more special general sections are, and how to use them, which are, again, all defined or all included as an appendix, but just how to use it, there's better information included after that. And then last but not least is the stream assessment section. I'm going to let Matt talk about this.
Sure, yeah. So for stream assessment, again, this will be familiar for those who are familiar with the natural channel section in the previous manual. Submittals need to demonstrate existing plan form analysis and inventory. There's a list, I didn't include them all in this slide, of channel characteristics and site information. And then further submittal requirements are relative to the analysis required for natural channel design. So bank full width, depth and discharge, longitudinal profile, cross sections, bed and bank material analyses, scour and critical shear stress analysis, plan form ratios, and then a channel condition scoring matrix. So these are all explained in the design criteria. In this section, like Lauren mentioned, this is just what is required to be submitted so that it's easier for designers to have a checklist and understand expectations for their deliverables.
And that brings us to our third and final Q&A session, really to talk about questions on any of those previous 4 sections we talked through.
Yeah, we've made up some time, so we probably have a good 10 minutes here or so we can take questions. So.
Okay, I see no questions in the text from this section, and I don't see any hands raised just yet. So we can go back to some earlier questions. We had one from Braden Taylor way back when we were talking about 5602. For a redeveloped site, for example, that reduces the impervious surfaces on site, would detention allowable release rates apply in 5602.c?
The answer is it depends. It depends on if the overall site impacts meets the thresholds for exemption. So if you are under the threshold for the site size or the total impervious area, it would not. But if you are over that, it would still apply.
Okay, and then another earlier question, Rebecca Thacker asked, can you elaborate a little bit more about the change in upstream detention or retention in relation to downstream?
Yeah, I'll take that one. We're really trying to look at this on a more of a site-by-site basis and not requiring a full, watershed analysis to really determine the overall, benefit of the retention and detention practices. So it's really only for, what's on your site, what's coming off your site to retain that and the retention-based practices, but then the detention would then be sized for that quantity that's coming off your site. We're not asking for any upstream or downstream evaluation of the impacts of those improvements on the overall watershed. So really trying to look at this only at the site level, knowing that, we're not going to go through a full watershed analysis for every site. So.
But the watershed impact is really baked into
Right.
the release rate requirements.
Right. That's a good clarification. Right. The goal is with these release rates that it's baked into some larger watershed analysis we've done that includes flow monitoring that kind of shows we're trying to get flow rates back to more mimic natural conditions. So.
Okay. Our last question, and this was an earlier one, has the evaluation of I&I retention detention design for the 6-hour storm, which has stated to cover 98% of events, found to mitigate the 24-hour 1% storm to a greater extent, similar extent, lesser extent in terms of downstream public. Oral flows 2% of the time, overtop, increasing flows downstream more than existing APWA 5600. Or is the upfront retention, infiltration, etc., working to improve in 99% of cases better downstream for 24-hour 1% event storms? Can you say this reduces more or the same as existing 24-hour 1% storm events? And if we need clarification, that was from Jay Walton.
Yeah, I've known James for a long time, so I won't call him out, but very detailed question there. I don't know if I have a exact response there. I mean, our goal is really trying to get more retention, detention. I think as a team, we believe that's going to create an overall higher value and as well as typical 24-hour events. And there's other studies across the country that have shown in some of these hurricane or tropical storm events that retention-based practices are having an impact on reducing flows downstream. So I don't have a detailed answer to that, James, but I think we, as a team, believe that moving to this approach where we're retaining and detaining storms that are more typical and getting more performance is going to have a downstream benefit, because at the end of the day, we're still removing a certain amount of volume from the system no matter what we do. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's really kind of our goal, is to, I think as Greg said earlier, volume becomes a currency now, and really trying to manage volume as close as we can to where it falls on the site, so we have a meaningful impact not only at the site, but as incrementally downstream. So.
Yeah, and I think, and Matt, you can chime in on this too. There was a lot that went into selecting the storm duration too. The Black and Beach team looked at hundreds of scenarios of kind of different iterations of the duration and the AMC conditions. But really that 6 hour storm kind of best fit for the overall region and watersheds that they looked at. And it's also how we most typically see storms happen in this area. So again, with the 24-hour SCS type 2 detention designs, we weren't seeing the performance that they were intended to do. We weren't actually seeing detention happening because that's not how our storms typically occur. So I think the new rainfall really better aligns with what we actually see based on real, recent relevant rainfall data, as opposed to a previous standard that was meant to be more synthetic and extreme.
Okay, we've picked up a couple other questions since then. One from John Persing. Are any construction specification updates anticipated to be added to APWA 2600? Guess 56.
No, we did not have any updates to existing 2600 specifications. So we really just have the addition of the green infrastructure specifications as part of this project scope.
Okay, and then a question from Matt Eblin. Is the intent for sites not asking for an exemption or waiver for the compliance calculator tables to replace the drainage studies typically provided during planning phase on site design projects?
Yes, that's the intent. So it's you'd have that consistent kind of upfront form basically, and attached to those forms are the actual calculation tables. So I failed to kind of hit on that well, but so the two slides that I shared up front are really kind of the cover slides. They are the cover pages, the overview, but attached to that are the detailed site inputs and like the drainage area and retention and detention design parameters. So the goal was that could align for both communities that are really getting into the weeds of the of reviews at that upfront planning stage, as well as smaller communities that really need more of kind of a high level verification that requirements are being met. But yes, that's the intent, is that concept analysis would replace that typical drainage report unless there's variances or additional criteria that would trigger that. But again, that will be up to the approving jurisdiction to implement the way that they see fit within their own processes.
Okay, if anybody else has any other questions, you feel free to raise your hand, come on video, drop a question in the text chat.
Okay. If we don't have any other questions, we'll move on here, I think. And if you still have questions to put in the chat, we'll just kind of cover the final review comment process here at the end of our presentation. But yeah, if you have questions, just please put them in the chat and we'll circle back here before we close out today. So wanted to reiterate the review process. So the link has been in the chat as well as the QR code up here. All draft documents are available on the MARCS website. when you go to that, you should be able to hopefully clearly be able to find those documents as PDF. The Excel tool is available that Lauren mentioned. So all that is up there. So you'll see I don't know if you want to say anything more about that, Lauren, on that side. I'll let you talk about that.
Yeah, we brought the screen grab up here on the right. So when you go to that web page, if you just kind of scroll down to this draft 2025 stormwater management or stormwater standards manual, that's where you can download the manual itself. So the preamble through section 5610 is that first link. And then the appendices can be downloaded separately, and then the compliance calculators underneath that. So like I said before, it is a macro enabled workbook, Excel workbook. So you will have to turn the macros on for it to be able to use all the functions of that, but you can download it there.
And then below that, we have how to submit your feedback. Option one, which is our preferred method, is to use the Bluebeam session, which is out there also on the MARC website. You can link to that through the bottom part of that screen grab that Lauren has up there. And then the second option we have is it's a SurveyMonkey, and it walks you through each section. So if you don't have comments on the early sections, please keep going through that and get to the section that you do have comments on. So we couldn't find any cleaner way to do that. So basically you'll have to kind of page through. If you don't have comments on section 5602, but you do on 5609, you'll have to, right, Lauren, kind of click through that to get to that section, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's really why we're promoting the Bluebeam session. You don't have to have a membership or anything to be able to use that. You can join it through the web, or you can download just a free version of their software and join a session that way. So you don't have to have a license to be able to do that, but it's a lot easier to review something and leave a comment in context, I think, both for the reviewer, but also for our team to understand what that comment is relevant to later. So really pushing people towards at least trying to use the Bluebeam session if you're comfortable with it.
Right. And because we anticipate a lot of comments, like I mentioned earlier on in this presentation, we are only accepting written comments in these two forms so we can track the comments so that we can have a response to comment after the review period closes. So you go to the next slide. We're going to hold the review period. Oops, go back up one. Sorry, it's all right. I guess we kind of hit on this, but really I just wanted to reiterate the review period will be open for basically a little over 6 weeks from today, all the way through the end of the week ending April 4th. We're hopeful that gives everybody enough time to fully digest this extensive new manual, talk with your colleagues. If you can provide summary comments that might represent more than one person, we'd appreciate that. So we kind of get some consolidated comments, but only in written form in those two forms that we talked about. And the comment period will close April 4th. Okay. And here's kind of a rundown of what we currently see as the final process for adoption, understanding that based on feedback and direction from the management stakeholders and or APWA Kansas City Metro chapter, these dates could change, but this is kind of how we see it right now. I mentioned the review period is kind of where we're going next. In that review period, we are still working with the management stakeholders, which are those 32 communities that we meet with monthly. We have a planned meeting on March 5th with them to talk about some of their initial review comments on this updated manual, this new draft. And then after the review period closes on April 4th, our intent is to organize and summarize those comments for response. Most likely in some, obviously, table format of how we'll address those comments. Depending on the number of comments, we'll probably need several weeks to get through those. And then based on those comments, what we're envisioning is to develop what we call a final draft manual, hopefully by the end of May for a posting of early June. And right now, looking at a potential special KC Metro chapter membership meeting for a vote. Right now, just proposing April 18th, but obviously that date can change. So just wanted to let everybody know kind of that current schedule. Like I said, it could change, so stay posted on that, but that's the intent right now. Okay. Next slide. I think that's it. Joe, any other questions out there we need to address?
No, it looks like Natalie is
Okay.
handling technical issue on a
Yeah.
calculator download. But yeah, I don't see any other questions. If we do have any more, feel free to raise your hand, pop your question into the text chat.
Natalie, I would say that that link appears to be working for me. I just wanted to check it. It appears to be going through. So,
Well, I do want to thank everybody for their time today. Hopefully, this gives you a good background and overview of the manual. Please review it, provide us comments on those two forms, and I guess hope everybody stays warm. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.